G'day and welcome back to the channel. My name is Bruce Simpson. I'm a full-time YouTube content creator who makes videos about model aircraft and drones. This is a little prelude to the video you're about to watch because I need to make it very clear. This is my full-time job. I do this full-time, nothing else. This is what I focus on. I develop safety technology and I make videos that hopefully entertain and amuse and inform. It's really important. And of course, it's not cheap to do that. I live from my earnings. Now, YouTube earnings, forget them. They're a waste of time. I don't rely on them anymore because they are unreliable. In fact, I've turned off mid-roll ads, as everybody knows. No mid-roll ads because it's just not worth the aggravation to you people to have your viewing interrupted by an ad that earns me nothing. I run pre-rolls and post-rolls. That's it. You watch 2 ads at the beginning. That's it. No more interfering with your viewing pleasure or displeasure, depending on whether you give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So this video is an important one because it deals with the future of the hobby and the threat it's under. And I would like to take a moment just to start with, and I don't do this often, is just to remind you that I do have a Patreon. And in fact, most of my revenue, most of my earnings, most of the money I live off and use to create these videos and other stuff and develop my safety technologies like the ADSB alarm, it all pretty much comes from Patreon now. So if you want to support me in my crusade against rampant over-regulation around the world and my crusade to make sure people fly safely and to bring you fun, entertaining, enjoyable snippets from the flying field, then feel free to do so. I'm not going to twist your arm. If you're poorer than me, then don't give me your money. Keep it for yourself. You'll need it. But if you've got $1 a month that's going spare and you want to support the cause, you want to support my efforts to make sure that regulators are held to account and that they don't sneak things through like you're going to see in this video, then please just give it a thought. Give it a thought. There you go. Not begging anymore. That's it. Let's get on with the video. G'day and welcome back to the channel that brings you drapes, curtains from the 1970s. Nobody else does that. I go the extra mile for you people. But today I want to talk again, because this is really, really important. I want to talk again about that advisory circular the FAA has put out because it's really, 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 really worrying. Why is it worrying? Well, I'll tell you what's happening here. Now, when the FAA, well, this applies to most government agencies around the world, certainly in the USA. When a government agency wants to create a new rule or regulation that's going to affect a lot of people, there is a process they have to go through, a step-by-step process that has been put in place to provide checks and balances to ensure that these regulators don't just go stupid and make rules without that are unfair, unreasonable, or excessively restricted. So they have this thing called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This was done with remote ID recently. You know, the FAA decided we want to have remote ID. We want to make sure that every drone has a transmitter on it that broadcasts its position continuously through the internet to a central control system so that you can't even take off until you've got clearance to do so from our UTM, our traffic management system. And the obvious extension there is, and you'll have to pay, you have to pay for your internet connectivity and you'll probably have to pay a fee per takeoff. The FAA were dead keen on this. This was their whole goal for this remote ID NPRM. So to get that rule in place, they couldn't just go out and say, right, you've got to do this. They had to go through the process established by the politicians and Congress, I suppose. I don't know about how the US political system works, but they had to go and do that. So they issued an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. They put that out there, and then they had to allow the public, the people who are going to be affected by this rule, to come back and give comment to say, oh, this is good or this is no good. And that's exactly what happened with the Remote ID NPRM. Over 50,000 people responded to the FAA's NPRM. That was a pretty big number. So they had to wade through all those submissions, all those comments, and then categorize them and then come up with a response document showing that they had listened to the people and then provide a final rule, which was modified somewhat on the basis of the feedback they'd received. And the only real modifications to that final rule versus the proposed one was brought about because really they wanted to do things that couldn't be done. They wanted to have network remote ID, and even the people who would be providing those services, the ones who stand to benefit most, they said, we don't have the technology. There is no ubiquitous internet coverage of the USA, so we can't really provide you with network ID even if we wanted to. Even though you want to, it cannot be done. So the final rule said, at this time, we're not going to use network ID. They left it room to say we're going to do it later. When the technology comes along, we will still be doing what we thought we were going to do in the first place. But they've made a few tiny concessions based on the feedback. And that's how the NPRM is supposed to work. That's how the rulemaking process works. They can't just go willy-nilly and say, we're going to do this and to hell with the rest of you. They have to follow the rule for making rules. Or do they? Because this new advisory circular, in fact, the whole exemption, let me go back a bit, unwind, let me rewind. Let me go back here and look at the way we get to, or way you guys, I'm not in America, so this doesn't affect me directly, but it will in the long term. In America, if you want to fly a drone or a model aircraft, you've got to get a Part 107 commercial certification to do so. Yep, you do. Unless you use the exemption that has been granted. That exemption is, where is it? I have to find it here. Can't find it. It's here somewhere. Oh, here we go. The exemption is USC 44809. USC 44809, that's the exemption that has been created to let you and your mates fly your drones and your model aircraft without having to have a Part 107 certification. And that's been created, but there are conditions. There are conditions. You cannot claim that exemption. You cannot say, I'm flying under the exemption, unless you follow all the requirements of that exemption. If you don't follow those requirements, then you are not able to fly recreationally. You've got to go and get your Part 107 certification. So let's look at what those requirements are. And the first one is you must fly only for recreational purposes. You can't claim the exemption if you're earning money from your flying. That sounds reasonable, because otherwise you should get a Part 107. But the next bit is really important. It says you must follow the safety guidelines of an FAA recognised community-based organisation. And this is the catch. This is what the FAA has done to sidestep the entire rulemaking process from this point forward. From this point forward, they can change the rules without having to go for consultation. And this is what's called regulatory indirection. It happens when regulatory organisations don't want to be bothered with the checks and balances that are put in place to make sure they're doing their job properly. They want to say, yeah, that's not for us. We're far too important to actually follow our own rules. We'll sidestep them. And that's what they're doing with model aircraft and drone regulation through this exemption. It is unbelievably bad. And I don't think a lot of people have noticed this. They haven't seen this in the USA. I've been around a long time. Look at the mileage on this face. I'm not a young fella, and I've seen this happen many, many times before. And it invariably happens when a regulator wants to make changes that they're pretty sure wouldn't get by the consultation process. They want to do things that they want to do them quickly. And sometimes the justification that's used for this regulatory indirection is we're dealing with a very rapidly evolving situation. We can't afford the time lags involved in going through the normal consultative process. We need to be able to move quickly to ensure safety is preserved. The FAA hasn't claimed that in this case. So I think what they're doing is they're saying, well, we just wanted to actually avoid the situation where we have to read another 50,000 submissions and respond to them. That's a lot of work. We can't drink as much coffee or eat as many biscuits if we're having to deal with these submissions. So they've just said, well, we just sidestep that process. So what they've done is they've said, you must fly under the safety guidelines of a CBO. And that doesn't apply yet. It only applies once CBOs have been recognised. Once the FAA starts recognising CBOs, you will not be able to claim you're flying recreationally unless you can say, I'm flying under the safety guidelines of the AMA or the FPV Freedom Coalition or whoever it is that is your the CBO that you choose to operate under their rules. So what this does is it means that the FAA can come along. They've already done this with the advisory circular. That advisory circular contains some recommendations, some suggestions, a list of things that organisations should be including in their safety guidelines if they want to become a CBO. And why would you want to become a CBO? What's the benefit of that? Well, only CBOs and recognised educational institutions and so forth can apply to have a FRIA, an area where you can fly without remote ID, an area where you can fly your model aircraft without too many restrictions and regulations and things. Only CBOs have that privilege. So if you're not a CBO, you cannot nominate an area for flying without all the implications of the remote ID legislation when it comes in. So there's huge benefits to being a CBO. It gives you credibility, it gives you a profile in the eyes of the FAA. So organisations like the AMA will be absolutely working hard to get CBO accreditation. So they will slavishly follow those guidelines. They'll make sure everything the FAA has recommended are included in their safety guidelines because it gives them a better chance of getting that recognition. And that's the power there, because if you've actually just said, okay, we'll do whatever you say, call us a CBO, we'll do whatever it takes to get that CBO certification, then when the FAA come back to the CBOs and say, well, look, we've actually decided that we don't think anyone should be allowed to fly FPV more than 500 yards from the takeoff point. Doesn't matter if they've got a visual observer, 500 yards, that's the maximum, or maybe 200 yards. Then the community-based organisations will almost certainly update their safety guidelines to include that restriction on the recommendation of the FAA. And because you must follow those safety guidelines in order to be compliant with the rule and therefore qualify as a recreational flyer, the FAA have effectively changed the rules that control our hobby without any kind of consultation, without accepting any submissions, by sidestepping the whole regulation making process through this regulatory indirection. Through telling the CBOs what their safety guidelines should be, they get to change the rules. They can add new restrictions. They could ban FPV if they wanted to. They could simply say to the CBOs, your safety guidelines must include a ban on FPV. And if the CBOs don't include that, then the chances are that their recognition as a CBO will be reviewed. Probably not immediately, but maybe later on they'll just say, well, I'm sorry, you no longer qualify as a CBO because you're not following our recommendations in terms of your safety guidelines. So we're going to have to say, sorry, you can't. Which means that if you were flying under that CBO's recommended guidelines, you lose that right. You've got to choose another CBO because your one has been unrecognised. Now you've got to go to another one, and they won't be, if they're still a CBO, chances are they've said no FPV. So FPV will be dead. They'll have wiped it from the face of the hobby without even a consultation, without having to do an NPRM, without having to make any kind of consultation with the hobby or anyone else. They'll just say to the CBOs, no, we're not having that. And the CBOs will go, oh, we still want to be a CBO, so yeah, we'll put that in there. And there you go. They have sidestepped the checks and balances, the mechanisms that have been put in place by Congress to ensure that organisations like the FAA don't go out there and unnecessarily, unreasonably remove people's freedoms and rights. Sidestepped through regulatory indirection. And if you're in America, it's affecting you. It's going to affect you now, unless you go and make a comment on that draft thing and say, no, not having it, not having it, unacceptable, not acceptable. So that's where you're headed. As I say, I've seen this happen before, and it's usually done when a regulatory organisation doesn't want to be bothered with all the hassle and work involved in doing a consultative process, or if they want to do things that they know would not pass the scrutiny of public consultation. They just do this little thing, off you go. They usually say, okay, here's the rule, but to qualify, you must follow this policy or these guidelines. And the guidelines can be changed willy-nilly, no consultation at all, but the rule says you must follow them. So if you don't follow the guidelines, you're breaking the rules. So effectively, they've made new rules. Effectively, they've made new rules without having to consult anybody. It's unacceptable, but it's something that happens. It's a tool used by bureaucracy to make sure that they're not held accountable for what they do, and they can do whatever the hell they want without anybody checking over their shoulder. If you think that's acceptable, that's fine. I don't think it's acceptable in the least. And the problem we've got is I said right when Section 336 was revoked in the USA, and the FAA was given the power to regulate the hobby, I said this is the thin end of a very dangerous wedge. And that has proven to be the case. We had registration, mandatory registration. I said, no, you should not register. It's going to encourage them. And it is the thin end of this big fat wedge, and they're sliding it between your butt cheeks, and you don't feel it yet, but you'll feel it. So registration, it's only $5. It's only $5. Who cares? I'll register, no problems. And then, of course, now we have remote ID. Now we're going to put a broadcast transmitter on our models. Oh, okay. And we have freers. So if you're not going to put the broadcast transmitter on, you've got to find a freer, an area where you can fly without remote ID. And pretty soon we're going to have that network remote ID, and then pretty soon we're going to find, I'm sorry guys, but there's just no room for you in this airspace anymore. Your hobby is kind of cancelled. Yeah, okay, we'll give you a couple of little grassy fields miles from anywhere, and these restrictions, you can't fly beyond 200 yards away, and you can only fly models this size. It'll just keep getting tougher and tougher until the hobby, it won't be enjoyable. And when it's no longer enjoyable, it's gone, kaput in. The only people who will be flying models are outlaws. Outlaws. So you need to stop it, nip it in the bud. The bigger that wedge gets, the harder it is to stop. It really is. And we've got to take some pretty strategic actions. And I'm formulating some strategies that I think may be useful. For example, I'm doing a video in a couple of hours on the Gatwick incident, because Gatwick has been used by regulators around the world to justify many of the things they're introducing, like registration and remote ID. Oh, Gatwick, it was terrible. The airport was shut down for 3 days over Christmas, and new evidence has come to light on Gatwick. Now, we in the hobby have said for a long, long time, ever since 2018, how could a drone fly for over an hour and in driving rain and wind, this doesn't make any sense. How could it have been a drone? And in fact, even the police officer, one of the police officers, a detective superintendent, said it may not have been a drone, and he got stomped on very quickly. But evidence has come to light that it pretty much guaranteed certain wasn't a drone. Wasn't a drone. I've got pictures. I'll be putting them up on this channel in a video coming up later today, so watch for that. But again, they've used misinformation to start wiping out the hobby. If they're going to resort to dishonesty like that, and let's face it, I've got to say, the FAA is dishonest and disreputable. How do I know that? Because they stole my intellectual property. Remember the video? If I can remember, I'll put a card up. It'll be there somewhere, I suppose. They stole my video. And even worse than that, I can understand they stole it, but they didn't acknowledge and they didn't apologize. And those are the actions. Anyone can make a mistake and use a piece of footage by mistake. But when you're caught out, you apologize and you acknowledge. They didn't do that. They simply pulled the video down and re-edited it and put it up again. Not a word was said. No, I'm sorry, Mr. Simpson, we didn't realize it was your footage. No, nothing. That is the actions of a dishonest and disreputable organization. So do not trust the FAA now that they've chosen to go the regulatory indirection strategy to sidestep the whole NPRM process, to change the rules affecting our hobby and to shut us down over time. You guys, you don't know what's coming. It's a train. That light at the end of the tunnel, it's not the end of the tunnel. It's a train. Get ready. I'm telling you now, I was right about registration, right about remote ID. If you don't act, future generations will have no access to, no reasonable, no effective, no practical access to enjoy this hobby. You owe future generations that, because previous generations ensured that you had access. So don't shirk your responsibilities. I'm really serious about this. It's absolutely important. You guys need to stand up now and say, we're not having this. The NPRM process is there for a reason. You cannot subvert it by using regulatory indirection. Tell me what you think. Go to the comments. Go to the comments. Are you as outraged as I am? You should be. You really should be. Anyway, thanks to my Patreon supporters who make it possible for me to have these rants and raves and hopefully work to protect the hobby, because goodness knows it needs protection at the moment. Bye for now.